Welcome to the Module 7 lecture. Today's focus will be looking at the biotic and abiotic interactions in an ecosystem. And to do that, we will be looking at the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the hydrologic cycle. We are too old to use the terms water cycle anymore, but that's just what this means. Do not use water cycle. We are talking about the hydrologic cycle. Couple of terms that I would like for you to be familiar with. When we are looking at biogeochemical cycles, we are looking at the movement of matter between and within ecosystems. And the biosphere is the region of Earth where life exists. So this can be very close to the Earth's surface, slightly below, and even protruding into the atmosphere a little bit, because that's, birds can fly there and live there and be totally fine. First, let's look at the hydrologic cycle. Water is essential for living things. Over 1/2 of a mammal's body weight is water, which means that no organism can survive without it. Water also allows for the movement between cells and within cells. So when things need to be transported, like nutrients within cells, water is essential for that. Water is also the primary agent for dissolving and transporting the chemicals necessary for living things, so be that vitamins or other minerals. Let's look at the different parts of the hydrologic cycle. The first thing that happens is a cycle, so maybe it's not first, but one of the things that happens is that heat from our sun causes water from our oceans, lakes, and soils to evaporate. We also have water leaving close to Earth's surface from plants via transpiration. So on leaves, there are these pores called stomata that open and close to allow carbon dioxide to come in and oxygen to come out. So when those stomata are open, water can also be pulled out. So that will be transpiration. Then water vapor enters the atmosphere, cools to form clouds. Eventually, we have precipitation that falls back to Earth, which will either be taken up by plant roots and, ends up being transpired again. We can also look at evapotranspiration, which is the combination of the amount of evaporation and transpiration together. Some of the water that falls back to Earth is absorbed by soil and will percolate down into groundwater. And some will move as runoff across the land surface into streams and rivers, which will eventually make its way back to the ocean. And this whole thing is happening all the time, everywhere. Here is a nice diagram of the hydrologic cycle, which if you would like more details, you can, check that out in your book. Let's take a quick peek at how human activities impact the water cycle. We will talk more about issues relating to water when we talk about aquatic pollution and when we talk about land use. But the general idea here is that when we cut down lots of trees in an area, we have a decrease in evapotranspiration. That will lead to an increase in runoff and percolation, which will also increase erosion and flooding. So in areas where large deforestation has occurred, they're actually going to be more prone to erosion and also flooding. Humans have also diverted water to provide drinking water for ourselves. Let's next look at a math opportunity. So let's suppose each tree requires 20 liters of water per day. The water must be pumped to a tree plantation, which is just an area with lots and lots of trees, from a nearby stream. How many liters of water are needed each year to water a plantation with 900 trees? So, what do we need to do first? I will be using the train tracks method for this because that's what makes sense to me, but you do you. Just make sure you share your work and put units. So I'm going to start off. So I know that one tree needs 20 liters of water in one day. I also know, because we need to cancel out our days because we want it in liters per year, that there are 365 days in one year. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little tickled at how terrible my handwriting looks right now. Right. But so if I were to multiply this out, this would give me how many liters per year are for one tree. But in this case, I have 900 trees. So I'm going to multiply by 900 trees, which will give me, I'm going to write in scientific notation because writing out all these zeros would take forever. But at any rate, I will need 6.57 times 10 to the 6, so about 6.5 million liters of water per year. There we go. Okay, moving on to the carbon cycle. Carbon makes up about 20% of living things' body weights. So water's half, carbon is another 20%. Carbon is especially important for living things because it is the basis of building carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And as I hope you recall from Bio 1, these are essential for cellular structure and function. We have to have these things or nothing is going to do anything. There are 7 major processes that are part of the carbon cycle. One of them is photosynthesis. So during photosynthesis, autotrophs are removing CO2 from the atmosphere and releasing O2 back. Respiration, heterotrophs will consume O2 and release O2, knowing that autotrophs are doing this same process. We also have exchange, where CO2 from the atmosphere and CO2 dissolved in water are exchanged. We have sedimentation, where some CO2 dissolved in the ocean combines with calcium to form calcium carbonate, which eventually forms limestone and dolomite rock. We also have burial, where a little organic carbon from dead biomass is buried and incorporated into ocean sediments. These will be fossilized and some will be turned into fossil fuels. Then we have extraction, where humans are extracting fossil fuels, and combustion, which is combusting fossil fuels, and also volcanoes will release CO2 back into the atmosphere. Here is a lovely, lovely, lovely diagram of the carbon cycle. Human impacts on the carbon cycle are relatively big since the Industrial Revolution and starting in the late 1700s. So the combustion of fossil fuels leads to an increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, which alters the carbon pool balance, which leads to global warming. Humans have also impacted the carbon cycle by deforestation, which is decreasing the number of available autotrophs that can be photosynthesizing. Moving on to the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is one of the essential nutrients for living things because it is required for building proteins and nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. In the 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen gas, or N2, but this is not usable for most organisms on the planet. So the nitrogen gas will go through several chemical transformations before it can be useful to living things. So there are 5 big transformations that are going to, I guess I can leave myself there, that will occur during the nitrogen cycle. So the first is nitrogen fixation, where nitrogen gas is converted into ammonia and then to ammonium. This will be done by nitrogen fixing organisms like bacteria in the soil or cyanobacteria in an aquatic ecosystem. This can also happen from lightning, fires, and burning fossil fuels. Then we have nitrification, where the ammonium is converted into nitrite, and then eventually to nitrate, which can be used by plants. So that leads us to the next process, assimilation, where producers take up nitrogen, generally going to be in the form of nitrate, and incorporate it into their plant tissues, which will be passed up the food chain via consumption. So the plant has all of this lovely nitrogen, consumer eats it, now they have that nitrogen to be able to break down and use to build their own proteins and nucleic acids. Then we have mineralization, where decomposers like fungi and bacteria will break down waste, like poop, dead stuff, back into inorganic compounds like ammonium, which is also called ammonification. Then finally, we have denitrification, where bacteria convert what's nitrate back into nitrogen gas that can be released back into the atmosphere. And this is going to happen all over again. So we have fixation, nitrification, assimilation, ammonification, and denitrification. And here is a lovely diagram of the nitrogen cycle. Next, let's look at human impacts on the nitrogen cycle. So first issue is that nitrogen is generally going to be a limiting nutrient in an ecosystem, which means it's found in lower quantities than it needs. So there's more things that need nitrogen and not enough nitrogen for them to be able to do what they need to do. The issue is that lots of fertilizers will be nitrogen rich, which will lead to leaching, and so it ends up in the waterways. And this is not great for plants used in low nitrogen in soil. Last, let's look at the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is also an essential nutrient. It is required for nucleic acids and ATP, our favorite energy molecule. It is not found in the atmosphere, and it is typically found in the form phosphate. There are a couple of processes that are important for the phosphorus cycle. The first is that weathering of rocks moves phosphate into soil and water. So rocks are, super rich in phosphates. They get broken down. Now we have phosphorus in soil and water. Then we have assimilation and mineralization, where producers will take up the phosphate and incorporate it into their tissues, which will be passed on to the consumers later. Then sedimentation, where phosphate falls out of the solution in the ocean and forms sediments. And then we have geologic uplift, where ocean layers are lifted up to become mountains. And so now we have more phosphorus to weather and incorporate into soil and water, as you can see here. Last thing for today is looking at human impacts on the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is also a limiting nutrient, which will be found in large quantities in fertilizer, and some super bad things can happen here. So the excess phosphorus can leach into bodies of water, which then leads to a huge growth in producers because they have all the phosphorus they need. They're suddenly super happy. Then in the water, since we have lots of algae, that's called an algal bloom, which you can see those poor little duckies swimming in super green water. That's what an algal bloom looks like. Well, so then we have all these like algae now that have been super happy, reproducing. There's more than ever, but then they die, and their decomposition requires a lot of oxygen, which leads to the water becoming hypoxic. So there's not enough oxygen now in the water for the other aquatic organisms. And this is very bad for the other aquatic organisms because now they don't have enough oxygen to do all the things they need to do. So that's generally everything you need to know about our favorite biogeochemical cycles.